I'm Vicki Goodman, and I cannot think of a better way to begin our season than by hosting a program on stress and welcoming two superstar scientists in the field, Dr. Elissa Epel, professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCSF, and best-selling author, who is here to talk about her latest book, The Stress Prescription: 7 Days to More Joy and Ease, with Dr. Emran Mayer, gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and distinguished research professor at UCLA, and the renowned author of The Mind-Gut Connection. Dr. Epel is an international expert on stress, well-being, and optimal aging. In addition to being a professor of psychiatry at UCSF, she's also vice chair of psychology, and she directs the Aging Metabolism Emotion Center. Dr. Epel studies the environmental, psychological, behavioral, and social factors that impact cellular aging, and she also does research on climate wellness. In addition to The Stress Prescription, Dr. Epel co-wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Telemore Effect, a revolutionary approach to living younger and longer, with Nobel laureate Elizabeth Blackburn, which was translated into 30 languages. Her research has been featured in numerous venues, including TED-Med, The Today Show, CBS's Morning Show, 60 Minutes, NPR, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and science documentaries. Dr. Emran Mayer, in addition to being a gastroenterologist, neuroscientist, and distinguished research professor in the Department of Medicine at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA, is also the executive director of the G. Oppenheimer Center for Neurobiology of Stress and Resilience, and founding director of the Goodman-Luskin Microbiome Center at UCLA. He is one of the pioneers and leading researchers in the bidirectional communication within the brain-gut microbiome system, with wide-ranging applications in intestinal and brain disorders. In addition to the Mind-Gut Connection, he's also the author of the Gut Immune Connection and the recipe book, Interconnected Plates, published just this year. He's currently working on a masterclass and a PBS documentary about the Mind-Gut Immune Connection, and he's also the recipient of numerous awards, including the UCLA Award for Excellence in Integrative Medicine just this year. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's program will run for approximately 1 hour, with the last segment reserved for your questions. If you would like to ask either of our speakers a question, please type it into the Q&A, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible during the time allotted. We have over 1,800 people registered for today's program, so we appreciate your patience. For those of you with us for the first time, the Open Mind Lecture and Film Series brings together thought leaders at the intersection of culture and science for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health issues. It is proudly sponsored by UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors. Today's program is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofsemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs and videos from WOW, the joint Resnick Friends fundraising event that was held this past May with Oprah, U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy, Grammy and Oscar winner John Batiste, and Dr. Arthur Brooks. And please be sure to see our calendar of upcoming open events and special events, including the Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held in person for the first time this year and live streamed on Sunday, April 21st. And we are very excited to announce that our Teen Advisory Council is hosting their inaugural Gen Z Wellness Summit in person on Sunday, February 25th at UCLA. This event is free for high school students in the LA area. There will be discussions about the unique mental health challenges that teens face today, along with some great Gen Z entertainment. Visit our website for more details, and registration will be open very soon. And now let's gain some new wisdom by listening to Dr. Elissa Epel and Dr. Emran Mayer in conversation. Please join me in giving them a warm Zoom welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicki, for the kind introduction and for the invitation to participate in this exciting panel with good friend and admired colleague, Elissa Epel. I've recently finished reading her book. I mean, it doesn't take very long to read it because it's a nice, short, concise piece of writing. But I have to say, I've rarely read anything that has so much impact, practical impact and practical relevance for the reader. So I can only greatly recommend for anybody who is interested in this topic is listening to this panel to take a look at this book. And let me ask you, I mean, obviously this stage is primarily for Elissa, and she has lots of things to talk about. I'm just going to say a few words. Let me ask you the first question. Why did you write this book?
Okay, it's a good place to start. First of all, I'm so honored to be here and to be interviewed by you, Emran. And I insist that you say more than a few words because you know so much about stress and mental health from the different perspectives than I do, the gut, the microbiota, and we both share so many views about the environment, how that's impacting our mental health and interconnection. So this will be a dialogue, but I will talk about the book, and I'm so happy to hear that you liked it, because when it comes down to it, if we want to get really practical, it comes down to not just what's new and shiny, but simple foundational knowledge and science. Some of it's ancient, some of it's, recent clinical trials showing us what helps reduce our stress response. But I wrote the book because everyone is too stressed. Like in general, the data is showing that stress levels are rising so fast over the years. And of course, during the pandemic, we had, a mental health epidemic or crisis on top of coming into COVID with growing poor mental health, particularly among our young adults and youth. So surveys show that over 60% of adults feel overwhelmed by stress. We know that feeling has terribly impactful biological consequences. It's not just a feeling. It's how the body's feeling in its nervous system. It's affecting all of our regulatory systems. And so we don't need to be as stressed as we are. We're missing out on experiencing our lives fully. We're rushing around in threat mode too much of the time and not really living through our senses, through the amazing ability we have to be connected to other people and be connected to nature. When we're rushing, forget it. It's easy to miss out on too much of life. So that was my impetus was, gosh, I've been studying stress for 30 years. Can I just say something really found practical that every scientist would agree with? And can we try to use that without becoming overwhelmed with, I need to do 10 things. And it's hard to change our daily lifestyle.
I mean, one of the particular dangerous things about this stress epidemic is a lot of people are not really aware of it. It's this unconscious stress. So these processes that idle in the background in our brain and with influence on the body. And a lot of people that come down later in life with all these chronic diseases that we now sort of look in a similar perspective, probably have to a certain degree this low running, constantly activated stress response. Could you comment on this?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because that is exactly where stress science is now. We know when something stressful happens, we have the acute stress response. It's beautiful. It saves our lives. It's the only reason we're here, that our ancestors have survived. And it helps us basically rise up to different challenges in life. The problem is that subtle, low-grade, pervasive stress response. We don't turn off the acute response well. And so we sit in stress soup for sometimes most of the day without even realizing it. And what you're talking about, that kind of early onset of physical symptoms, not feeling well, and then developing a diagnosis for this or that. Stress has been shown to be part of that recipe, that it accelerates the biological aging processes. So inflammation, that's one of the major highways, of course, related to how you understand how gut diseases develop, and how I understand how aging is accelerated at the cellular level. And in every type of cell in our body, we are sensitive to inflammation. And what chronic stress can do is turn a cell, a healthy young cell, into a pro-inflammatory machine.
Yeah, and this is something that I think it's sort of gradually becoming common knowledge amongst, I wouldn't say all physicians, but a lot of physicians and psychiatrists as well, that this chronic low-grade inflammation arising from what you've called so appropriately these polycrises that people find themselves in. It's not just one crisis; it's multiple. It's environment, it's immigration, it's polarization, political polarization. I think there's a gradual movement towards accepting this as a universal risk factor, which may be a lot more important than many other things that we identify on a routine blood test in medicine, for example.
Exactly. Well, let's dive into the polycrisis for a minute, because I think we don't always realize it, but we have layers of threat or stress that we're exposed to. And that is affecting us in ways that capture our attention. We live in this attention economy. We have devices and screens that steal our attention and feed us danger signals, stressful images, threatening news, an uncertain future. So that's the news. And then there's social media, which is also feeding us social threat. We're not enough. We're not connected. We're alone. All of that sense that we're not, as an individual being, we're not okay. And all of those messages, of course, are very toxic to young social brains that are developing. And the other message that we get is also just that we are as good as how much we make or achieve or buy. And so time becomes this commodity. And boy, does our nervous system respond to that feeling of urgency, time pressure. We just can't, it's not sustainable to keep that turned on all the time. So the polycrisis, the different intersecting crises that we have, political, social instability, the unstable ecological system, the climate crisis, these are intersecting macro level situations that, whether we're watching the news or not, our body is aware of these levels and layers of danger that we live in. So we've always had the personal drama and the salient stressors that we're aware of in our daily personal life, but now we also have this whole layer of what is going to happen? What does it mean to be human? What is my role in this world?
Yeah, and our brains, I mean, somebody said this, are the ultimate prediction machines in the universe. And I think from what our brains are fed today with this overwhelming body of news, the predictions, unless you develop a resilience against it, are generally negative. We're not really predicting that. I have to say, so when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, everything was positive, everything was growing. There was no, shortages of positions at universities to study. So now everything has sort of changed into, so the brain makes all these negative predictions, which I think adds to this crisis, this mental crisis.
Yes, exactly. So in my book, one of the main themes that you're introduced to is this idea that our baseline state is actually that predictive state of the uncertain future or unknown danger. And so that's a very smart survival state that we need to manage by consciously turning it off. And so the good news is that we can reduce our feelings of stress within minutes. And it's not rocket science. We don't need to purchase and fancy technology to practice some of these fundamental ways that our body responds. The sensory world, touch, furry animals, hugs, touching, being in contact with nature, with other people, slowing our breathing. That's the tuning in beyond our being lost in our predictive brain, tuning into our body and the senses is more important than we ever understood. Chronic stress basically numbs our sensory experience. It creates, less of the neural signature for experiencing the senses with the insula. Now, the other ways we can immediately reduce stress are changing our breathing and changing the stimuli that we're surrounded by. And we can create those environments also for each other by being a beacon of calmness. By regulating our own stress, we're helping regulate that of those around us.
I mean, these things seem very easy. I encounter this in my practice that, we try to teach deep abdominal diaphragmatic breathing to a lot of patients, and it's something so easy to learn and then to maintain. But do you think enough people are actually following these guidelines that you just outlined? They're all simple when you talk about them, but how many people are doing this on a daily basis?
Well, I'll tell you, once you develop those cluster of symptoms and you don't feel well, you're much more motivated. And so sometimes it does take a diagnosis or a condition for us to put our health and our lifestyle first. And it's so wonderful to not wait that long. And when we have these opportunities in our workplace, in our schools, in our homes, to have rituals and practices that everyone does together, that is what our ancestors did. They didn't view trauma or wellness as an individual activity. They were working out their trauma through wellness rituals, through their body, through their singing and chanting and other ways of healing that it worked for them. And we're just, quite out of touch with those, although some of them are entering our, current repertoire of stress reduction. So one thing I've been studying is hot and cold, or extreme breathing exercises, these things that create a stress response and then create a really sharp acute recovery. And those are not new practices, but they're new in our scientific protocols of, we can study this type of yogic breathing or Wim Hof breathing and, apply the scientific lens and learn from it in ways that given our scientific models that we live by, we find it acceptable and not too fringe to bring into our mainstream workplaces. So, the congratulations on winning the Integrative Medicine Award. You're the last person I need to tell about how important the science of mind-body medicine is for our own wellness.
And I have to say, it is satisfying to see that, from the beginning of my career, where this was not something mind-body or mind-gut medicine that I would say amongst my gastroenterology colleagues. Today, there's, like at UCLA in the Digestive Disease Division, there are digestive wellness programs. So we've come a long way, I would say. But one thing that I think is missing or would really greatly enhance the effectiveness, if these skills and techniques would be taught early on in life, like in elementary school, even in kindergarten, with plays, built around. And I mean, there are some people that are working on this, but wouldn't you say that this would have the biggest impact if you teach it to the children then tell their parents about it, and it has sort of a chain reaction within the family?
Yes, absolutely. I think when we think about the culture that we want, the culture of health, not the culture of stress that we want to promote, all arrows point to the developing brain, the child in the context of the family, the community, the school. And so that also means that we as parents and caregivers need to be living a balanced lifestyle, modeling the practices, practicing together. So I love the children teaching the parents, but why should it be that it's this foreign thing learned in school? So, we're teaching mindful pregnancy skills, and then others are teaching mindful parenting and sensitive parenting right from early on in life. And those, we have amazing results. The ability to be sensitive and aware and regulate your own emotions is transmitted to the young baby or child. And so, for example, in our mindful pregnancy study, we taught pregnant mothers mindful stress reduction and also mindful eating. And so they were doing a lot of breathing, slow breathing, sending metta or loving kindness to their baby, putting their hands on their belly. And of course, there's movement and teaching them about whole food. And we definitely need to talk about what we're eating, because that's another huge factor that's shaping our aging and can either enhance or reduce our stress. But in this trial, what we found was that the pregnant moms had decreased risk of diabetes, so less glucose intolerance during pregnancy, less depression. The depression over 8 years was lower every year that we measured it. So we had this long-term effect, and no doubt that's because it was a critical period, both for the child and the mom, to be learning new ways of responding to stress during pregnancy. And then lastly, I'll say it did affect the children. So to your point about where do we start and how can we improve the mental health and the resilience of our children? The children, my colleague Nikki Bush tested them in the lab. So stranger situation, acute stress responses. They responded with a more resilient nervous system than the babies who didn't get the mindfulness training while they were in the womb. So we don't know if it was all prenatal, healthier, nurturing environment, or whether maybe the parenting was also more responsive once the babies were born. But we do know the kids had less doctor's appointments and they had more resilient stress responses. Yeah,
I was going to throw in something which I always found really interesting, that the prenatal events in a pregnant woman have significant effects on the gut microbiome of the mother, but it doesn't stay with the mother. It actually affects the offspring. When the baby is born, not with a C-section, but vaginally, that these altered microbes from the mother, these stress-induced microbial changes, are transmitted to the baby and inoculating the first, baby microbiome. So these techniques that, for example, for a pregnant mother, I mean, there's a lot of things a woman can do in order to give her child the best starting conditions and not
such a amazing example of direct intergenerational transmission through the microbiome, through the birth canal. So what type of events are you shape the healthy microbiome of the mom and then the baby?
Well, there's lots of events. I mean, the microbiome of the mother, for example, they produce metabolites like inflammatory molecules, and these molecules can cross the placenta and influence the development of the brain. So it starts really early. That also includes obesity and stressful life events. So these things are not, influencing the baby's brain directly, but indirectly through the mother. And then after birth, it's the it's the breast milk and the molecules that are in the breast milk. So a stressed woman, young mother will have another way of transmitting these stress microbes to the baby's intestinal tract. And then also like just the anxiety and stress of the mother after birth, will have an effect on the development of the infant. So there's multiple ways. It's kind of always, I find it always amazing how nature has designed these multiple, seemingly redundant communication channels that, we initially were focused, the microbiome science, always on the babies and the offspring. So now we know it starts prenatally, both in terms of the nutritional status, metabolic status, but also the stress level of the mother, that all are transmitted to the baby.
Yeah, such a beautiful example of how interconnected we are through these different pathways. And I'll add another pathway to your explanation. It's like safety and stress are the language that, the potent critical factors that our bodies respond to, our nervous system, and also that of our, of course, developing baby, but also the family, the system, any close or intimate partners. There is this synchrony of physiology. We find that with telomeres that, older couples have very strongly correlated telomeres, which is a way that our cells age. So they age similarly together. They both might have short telomeres or they might tend to be long, but the point is there's this covariation. That's the same with mood in a household within a day and cortisol levels. I'm not sure how much covariation there is in families through the microbiome. I mean, not I guess the horizontal transmission within family members, not the kids.
Yeah, this is really fascinating. I mean, the whole story that you wrote about in your previous book, The Telomere Effect, is fascinating. That this is something that almost seems like an integrator that integrates all these negative and positive influences in one measurable entity, in one small part of our genome. And so you've written about this also, that this has a big influence on these concepts: lifespan, health span, and disease span. And I find that also a really interesting concept, that for example, these effects on the telomeres have an influence on our health span.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to?
Yes, thank you for bringing up those. It's so helpful for us, instead of thinking of, how long do we want to live, and longevity seems, to be, or ultra longevity seems to be such a dominant goal. But the reality is, what we all want is health span, is years of living when we're feeling well, emotional well-being, physical well-being. So we want to push off the disease span, the years of living with disease, as long as possible, and make that just those last years of life and not a decade of life. And so that's when telomeres come in. Telomeres are these protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes that are very sensitive to stress signals. Any stress signals, the physical world, so biochemical stress signals, and then the social emotional world, which transduces to also biochemical stress signals or safety signals. So telomeres are, they tend to shorten as we age, but there's tremendous variance in the rate of shortening. And we have a lot more control over protecting our telomeres through our daily behaviors, keeping our biochemical stress low. And we do that through almost everything we do, and our lifestyle has an effect, either creating stress soup or reducing the amount of stress chemicals, inflammation, insulin, too much insulin and glucose, stress hormones like cortisol. So nutrition is one of the huge ways that we influence our level of oxidative stress and inflammation. But the the main story that you're pointing to is that telomeres are listening. They're listening to our lifestyle. They're listening to our emotional well-being, and they're responding. And so we want to make sure that we break up chronic stress and release chronic stress every day and give our cells a break so that they can restore their balance and rejuvenate and not be overtaken by chronic high levels of oxidative stress, for example, because that shortens the telomeres. So one thing, just to go back to this pregnancy transmission, I mean, the direct transmission of the microbiome is so big and important. Turns out the telomeres have a direct transmission too through the maternal germline. So we know that, for example, parents with very, very short telomeres have children with short telomeres. So there's a direct transmission through the egg, the telomere size. But so if, presumably if a mom had a very stressful telomere shortening in her lifetime, she would pass a little bit of that down. But the other piece is that the prenatal experience, stress during the prenatal period, predicts shorter telomeres on day 1 of life. So we think that there is a very important level of stress or well-being during pregnancy that is shaping telomeres. And that's important because that means that's a initial setting of how long our telomeres for the rest of our life. And so while we can work hard to protect them, we want to start off with long telomeres.
Yeah, this brings me to another question that I actually never found the answer for this, so maybe you have it. So there's big portions of people that experience tremendous amounts of stress early in life during pregnancy. Just talking about the recipes, the refugees. When you look at these images, how people migrate up from Brazil to the jungle to make it to the US and being in these camps, and also, I mean, the concentration camps and the experience that people had. Despite these things, these horrible things, there's still a lot of people that live into old age. I mean, for example, as you know, like Holocaust survivors often live into their early hundreds. How do you explain that? Do they have particularly resilient telomeres, or are they born with more resilient telomeres?
It's a great question. I should know the answer to that. I'll get back to you on that. We do know that centenarians, healthy centenarians, people who live to 100 or more, they do have longer telomeres and lower inflammation. There's some genetic contribution to that, as well as those, blue zone factors of a community that's active and socially connected, eating the Mediterranean diet. So on top of that, there's a genetic piece. Now, it is remarkable that people who have survived severe existential trauma, genocide trauma, it is that many of them would live so long. What I can tell you is that there is often a price to mental health and stress calibration. And you probably know about the work of Rachel Yehuda and others who have looked at the epigenetics in a machine learning way, in an unbiased way. The genes that come out different, transmitted all the way to grandchildren, are stress-related genes. So the glucocorticoid system is altered. And I think there's a lot of experiential transgenerational trauma that exists in people who are offspring of Holocaust survivors and other traumas like that. And we're just starting to understand that and learn about that. What does it mean to have inherited trauma imprints? And how can you stay well? So even though my book is about stress, it really is about understanding we are sensitive animals. Stress is the love language. Stress keeps us alive. And so we're very sensitive to stress. And if we don't respect that and learn about how our mind works, and that we may be more stress sensitive than other people, given our life experience or our grandparents, for example, we're just going to be kind of like a pinball being battered around by the hostile and unfriendly polycrisis environment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could talk about this topic still a lot. One thing I want to come back with, as long as we have time for this, you mentioned early on this this link to the environment. So stress, or this concept of interconnectedness that, I mean, our environment is also under severe stress. Many of the boundaries that have been calculated for health of the planet are under severe stress, and the boundaries have already been passed, more than anticipated. Do you think, I mean, I sort of have my own ideas about this, how this environmental stress is related to the human stress. But I first want to get your opinion on that.
It goes both ways. So nature still exists and is beautiful. And yes, it's changing. And yes, there's devastating loss. But our body is evolved to be attuned to the natural world. And there was such a beautiful science on nature effects, on green mind effects. And so that is one of our solutions. That's what many people survived by during COVID, whether they realized it or not. They were outside more. They were appreciating nature. They were calmed by nature. Even people with a view of nature during, long lockdowns actually had less, and controlling for income and type of house had less anxiety and depression during those acute COVID pandemic months. So nature, we're dependent. Our well-being is fostered by nature. And of course, we're so dependent on it. We are nature. Everything in our body, the water we are made of is from our local water. If it's got, metals and contaminants, so do we. Just that the permeability between our body and everything we eat and the air we breathe is so high. And it's hard for us to realize that because we feel separate.
Yeah. And
so tell me how you think about nature, environmental stress and psychological stress.
Yeah. So this is a topic that I got really interested in. I've always been concerned about environmental issues and causes, but to realize how this interconnectedness between the microbes living in the soil with the plants that are grown in that soil, and then the same plants that we eat and they get into our intestine, to our own microbiome system, and how that affects, the mind and the brain, to me is one of the most amazing insights, that so our food, even if we are on a Mediterranean type diet, the many of these vegetables and fruits are depleted of many of these health beneficial components, the micronutrients, polyphenols. So, and that's because with chemical industrial agriculture, you don't let the microbial ecosystem in the soil do the job, but we throw in all the chemicals. And so when we consume these foods, not only are they, sprayed and covered with glyphosate, but they also contain much fewer of those health promoting molecules. So clearly the stress that we are under, I think if you put on different glasses, you'll see the same thing is happening to nature. It's part of it is, it's sad to see the extinction of species, something that happens in our gut as well. But if you're concerned about our health in the first place, then I think we should pay a lot of attention to these environmental impacts of stress that modern life has really created and is continued to do. It's not that we have, there's a few people that grow their food organically or regeneratively organically, but the majority still relies on. So recently talked to people in Canada who said that almost all the vegetables that Canadians buy are grown with GMO, and I mean the GMO by itself doesn't make that much difference. It's the glyphosate that is associated with it, and that we ingest in increasing amounts. So yeah, I think for anybody who is interested in their own well-being and stress reduction, I think I would encourage people to look at their environment as well, and what's going on there, and what they can do to.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. There is no well-being. There is no human health without the well-being of our environment. And we're so interdependent in so many ways. We notice it when things go quite wrong. But it is like you said, with chronic unconscious stress, creating these early unwellness and disease conditions. It's certainly the same with our living with the chemical, big agriculture, et cetera. None of us are free of those chemicals in our body. The good news is, I mean, from what I understand, we do know the answers. We understand how to turn toward regenerative agriculture and refortify and rejuvenate the soil and the microbes. And so those models, the people doing that work, are so important. It is part of also mental health, not just being connected to the land and doing that work, but when we eat these foods that are rich in the micronutrients, we actually improve our mental health. And there are, like this, the environmental psychiatry world is really lighting up, and people are starting to hear about this. But even so, with depression and anxiety and ADHD, even if these are not caused by these deficiencies in the micronutrients, they can be treated by them. Micronutrient supplements, as well as these, I will say a healthy Mediterranean diet that has some local food, right? Not the stripped, low nutrient commercial food. But most of us don't have access to that. So it is important to realize that is part of what we need to change for human well-being.
And this, so you brought this up in your last sentence. I mean, there's also a big divide in terms of both the stress level, but also the access to, to healthy foods and to education of healthy lifestyles, which is a socioeconomic divide in this country. That yes. there's a lot of people, who live in food insecurity. I for example, I could not believe when somebody told me about the numbers amongst UCLA students, how many live in food insecurity.
Yeah.
So they don't have the time or the money to do some of the things that we have been talking about, including the supplements. So how do you think that is going to be resolved as a society? We're some of the things that you and I are preaching and totally convinced of, and benefits primarily the people living in the bicoastal areas, but not the ones in the south or in socioeconomic deprived parts of the country. How do you think we can solve this?
Through trauma, we are being forced to transform, and our young people are they are demanding this. And so it is obviously we're in a time of crises and we don't have that much time, but the amount of awareness raising, the conscious revolution, the social tipping point, we're in it. We can't see exactly where we're at, but all of the awareness about we can't keep, creating this and eating this level of animals, of meat. We can't sustain this. It's all this part of this interconnected climate crisis. Mm-hmm. And so I know that teaching, we're actually teaching a climate class to our UC colleagues, UCLA, actually all 10 UCs. And the point is to train our young adults who are feeling the heaviness of their future, of the polycrisis, to train them in resilience skills, including mindfulness and the models of change. How does social change happen? We are part of it. They are part of it. And we have no other choice than to become part of this movement of change. So I like the quote that action is the sponge for anxiety, that the only way to reduce the distress, especially that young people are feeling, is to become part of the solution.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this conversation. I've seen Vicky come on, so I guess that's an indirect signal that we've got the transition to the...
We took a few extra minutes. Sorry, Vicky, but
So,
Amarin had a very meaty question of how are we going to get out of this? And I don't have any simple answers, but it is what it is going to be communal and social transformation. There's no other way.
well, first of all, I want to thank you both. It's really an honor to have you here with us today and to have you here to share your vast knowledge and expertise with all of us. It's been a very enlightening conversation, and I think we all gained a lot of wisdom by listening to the two of you in conversation. We do have a lot of questions. Pamela is asking about what's the difference between a resilient stress response and a non-resilient stress response? I wonder if you could comment.
It's a great question. We throw around those words. I think the one thing that most researchers will agree on is that a resilient stress response means that we recover quickly. And in that recovery, we actually often become more strong. If we're talking about our cells, they're actually more rejuvenated and younger. And if we're talking about our emotional well-being, we've often developed skills and perspectives so that we've had post-traumatic growth, or we've exercised our muscle of dealing with acute stress so that we're more stress resilient for the future. So stress resilience is the ability to recover, and it explains what the bridge between acute stress and chronic stress. When we're experiencing too much acute stress and we don't recover, it becomes chronic stress. And we just published a paper that will come out any day called Deep Rest. And the whole paper is helping us understand that we're not getting enough deep rest, that we need to actually consciously practice breaks during the day. Use any practice from any tradition. There's common underlying mechanisms of feeling safe, of slowing our breathing, of using our body, getting into our actual sensory experience, mind-body practices. We are kind of done comparing them and saying which is better than, which is the best. And they all tend to work on telomeres, for example. Helen Lavretsky of UCLA has shown, that a chanting exercise for caregivers can promote cell rejuvenation through telomerase activation and reducing inflammation. And who would have thought of that? And so meditation, yoga, qigong, chanting, we find that this cell aging system that I studied, telomeres and telomerase, respond to all of them.
Thank you. I heard you interviewed before, and Robin is bringing up a question about true relaxation and deep restoration. How do we practice that?
Well, asking ourselves, doing mindful check-ins during the day to first just become aware of what's present, what stress we may be holding in our body, doing a check-in, not just in our thoughts and feelings, but actually, are your hands clenched, and noticing, are your shoulders tight, and actually releasing the stress that we're holding. Now that helps us come back to closer to a relaxation baseline. I like to think of relaxation as a sacred state when we're connected to people or nature. We are not just, watching a leisure entertainment is fabulous and important, but true relaxation is actually a more whole body experience of connection. And then deep rest is a precious state when we are in a fully receptive mode. And so most of us don't get that at all or get much of it, but yoga classes, massage, all those mind-body practices you feel safe, your breathing changes. There's all sorts of ways to get that easily. I always like to throw out Insight Timer, which is just a free library. It has yoga nidra before bedtime is a wonderful window to reduce some of the residual stress from the day, listening to an guided audio of what we call yoga nidra that guides you through a very sensory whole body experience, or meditation or slow breathing. It's just any of these and all of these work if you do them, if you like them, finding what works for you.
So a quick question to this topic. Do you think is there a difference in the effectiveness of if you do these things online with a teacher online, if you do them by yourself, before you go to bed, or is it much better, much more beneficial if you do it in a group setting?
That's a great question. I think there are different levels of depth of experience and benefit, but they're all good and all important. There is the ability to be in a group or sangha and go to a place where you're surrounded by social cues of put the phone away, and it's, there's music, there's other people doing it. That is very powerful. And we're just coming back to some of that post-COVID. But the ability, starts with ability to self-regulate, but also noticing how wonderful it is to do it with a partner or to do it with a child. That level of both accountability and the ability to co-regulate is important for us to recognize.
Thank you. In the world we live in right now, there is so much uncertainty. How do we practice mindfulness and these techniques in a world that has so much uncertainty that breeds stress?
Mm-hmm. So chapter 1 is about uncertainty, and chapter 2 is about control. We want certainty. We love control. And it's so important for us to discern and recognize that most of the things that we are stressed about, that take up a lot of mental real estate, that keep that stress arousal on high, are not things that are within our control, and that we can't have certainty about the future. So that level of surrender and being present with our the certainty of the present is what we can embrace when we're practicing deep rest or relaxation or connection. Recognizing when we're safe and we can let down is something we're not great at, because we're looking, the predictive brain is always looking ahead and looking for danger stimuli. So uncertainty is fascinating because it is a big part of our current global situation, where we really can't be certain about what's going to happen with so many different situations. Protecting ourselves from media is really important. At UC Irvine, Alison Holman and Roxy Silver have shown so beautifully dose-response relationships between us watching disasters, for example, visual images, and having anxiety symptoms and even cardiovascular symptoms years later. So this is potent. We vicariously experience trauma, and we can also vicariously experience safety, love, connection. I have lots of little apps of animals and Tank's Good News and things that remind me of all of the, beautiful things happening at the same time.
I mean, one Buddhist advice would be, practice equanimity, so you actually can watch the world around you and not react to it. I think that's a skill. Like when I was younger, I never really paid much attention to that and why you would want to do this. But I think now, being overwhelmed with all these polycrises, that would seem a really wise attitude to practice that. So you don't let your ego trigger the alarm bells constantly based on its predictions, which often are wrong or biased in a negative way, but just experience, the world around you in a neutral, non-reactive way.
Thank you. Dr. Mayer, actually, as long as you just spoke, Elena is asking how you joined the digestive health program at UCLA.
The digestive wellness program, I don't have this off the top of my head, the email, but if you Google the UCLA digestive wellness program, you'll find the directions to this. It's a really exciting program with dietitians, psychologists that provide some of the skills that we talked about today, and not too many universities have that kind of a program, and I think it's exciting that our division chief basically made this a priority to establish that.
Sounds like we could all benefit from that program. We have time for a couple more questions. Diana is saying she's a teacher of children as a children's minister at Westwood Unified Methodist Church, and she'd like to know what skills she can teach to little ones.
I love that question. I also love the question from another Diana, maybe the same one, saying, that women are caregivers of children, and some of the science that we're talking about with pregnancy and how stress affects pregnancy feels blaming. And I have to address that, because whenever we talk about perceived stress, like, the model is so individual, and like we're blaming the person for their stress response. And the reality is that as a society, as a community, as a family, as a church, we have to understand the sacredness of pregnancy and of early parenting, as the childhood's brain is developing, and develop those supports so that moms aren't exposed to food insecurity, toxic stress, violence. This is what, when we did our mindfulness intervention, we were working with low-income women, and the amount of, let's say, amazing quick learning, resilience, and strength when you offer people material resources, for example, how people respond to that. I will say it shows us what we need to change our programs for protecting pregnant parents, pregnant women, or early parents. But we can't, it has to be a social situation where we're changing resources. So I've been, talking with a lot of anthropologists. They hate it when we just say we're reducing individual stress, because really we need to create these supportive networks and systems. And so I guess I'm apologizing for it sounding blaming, but it is true that we know that we need to help pregnant women with more support, both emotional and with resources.
Thank you so much for that explanation. One last question regarding, just losing it here, there's so many questions, but it was about childhood trauma and having experienced childhood trauma, entering now adulthood. What advice would you have for people of that situation?
We know that childhood trauma makes us so sensitive to stress that when we experience small stressors, they feel like big stressors. We feel more threatened. We don't feel the safety that others can feel so easily. And so knowing that and having so much both self-compassion as well as accommodations and shaping your environment to support you is so important. So we are, for example, studying, I guess the good news is we think that in our studies that having in the moment through apps or through groups in the moment, self-compassion and mindfulness, mindful support that speaks to the inner child can be very helpful for people with early trauma. People with early trauma have a lot of neuroplasticity. They benefit more from many mindfulness programs. We studied Deepak Chopra's retreat center, and the people who were practicing meditation with early trauma did not show these typical correlations between severity of early trauma and anxiety and depression. In our control group that we brought in from the community, we see these strong correlations, as we do in population health data. So what I'm saying is the brain is neuroplastic. What you do each day can support you so that your sensitive stress response system can, be calibrated downward and have a day where you're not overreacting and you're giving yourself time to recover, and you're surrounding yourself with people who are supportive and not triggering you and critical, et cetera. So I think choosing our both social and physical environments is very important.
One quick comment to this before our time is over. So our group has also been really interested in studying stress responsiveness and what impact this has on, for example, one study we just finished on the recurrence rate of inflammatory bowel disease, ulcerative colitis, and so this increased stress responsiveness, phenotype is one of the best predictors, who has the largest number of these flares later on in life. And there's also evidence in another group of gastrointestinal disorders with IBS that they have, more severe symptoms. And one big component of that stress, hyper-stress responsive phenotype is this early life trauma, which sort of really plays, I would say, the key role in this. There's other factors as well, but genetic factors, and but it's definitely something that if you want to intervene and help people, I think it should be primarily targeted at this particularly vulnerable group.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are out of time, but just in summary, there are a number of questions here just asking for practical tips that in the title of your book, Elissa, you mentioned. If you could just give a few practical tips that we can take away and use in our daily lives in summary.
Okay. So the magic of yes, it's full of practical tips. Each of the 7 days introduces a concept for you to understand the science of. So once you understand it, it is so much more meaningful. It's so much more motivating. So for example, there's a chapter on deep rest and on how breathing works. Why I could just tell you to slow your breathing. And you might have heard that 100 times. And like Emran said, do we really do it? But when you read about the science underlying it, you understand that you are changing the biochemistry of your blood so that you're reducing the anxiety response, that reflex. When we're having it's about the CO2-O2 balance, and we want to change that so that we're absorbing more oxygen and breathing lightly, slowly, naturally. And so it takes a little bit of practice. It takes understanding. You might feel more anxious before you feel better. So that's an example. So the book leads us through both understanding mind shifts toward positive stress responses, and as well as things we can do with our body. But using our body to reduce stress is advanced stress reduction. We think we need to meditate out of it and think differently, and that's hard. We need that, and we need the direct practices that create either deep relaxation or positive stress in our mind-body complex. And it turns out that our body, there's, roughly 80% of the neural pathways from our body to our brain, 20% from the brain to the body. That's just a simple, rough way of explaining, wow, our mind shapes our body, but our body really does shape our mindset and influence our brain states.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both to you, Dr. Epel, and Dr. Mayer. We are so grateful to you. You gave us a lot to take away, unpack, and use in our daily lives. So thank you both. Thank you, everybody, for the privilege of your time. We look forward to seeing you back for our next Open Mind on Thursday, October 12th. 5 p.m. we will be here, and our speaker will be Dr. Sarah Manning-Peskin, author of A Molecule from Madness, Tales of the Hijacked Brain. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe, stay well, and we will see you back on October 12th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.